Well, welcome back. This is Ralph Brindis, and we're now at the time that CTAF is going to be voting on clinical effectiveness and value. I want to remind our CTAF panelists that the link to the voting questions will be in the chat. And I also want to remind that only the members of CTAF panel will be voting. With that in mind, I hope you all had a good lunch, a good break. And Grace, maybe we can go ahead and show our first question.
Yes, Ralph, did you want to read the question, or would you like me to read the question?
I think I'll take it on. So first of all, to make sure that we understand what the questions are all focused on, is the patient population is for adults with non-relapsing secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. Next slide, please. So the first question that we are going to be voting on is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tolobrutinib is greater than that of supportive care? And we want to define as pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments to alleviate the symptoms of MS. So Grace, could you take us through the clinical evidence to help us answer that question?
Yes, thanks, Ralph. So I'll refer the panel members to your evidence summary, which hopefully you should have with you. And you'll remember that we have one randomized trial, Hercules, in this population of tolobrutinib versus placebo. And this is in the non-relapsing SPMS population. If you look at figure 3, that is the primary endpoint, time to 6-month confirmed disability progression. And here we have a hazard ratio of 0.69, or a 31% decrease in risk of this outcome, of having this outcome. And this is at 24 months is where this outcome was measured. If you then look at table 4 and 5, these are the disease activity outcomes and the disability progression outcomes, the secondary outcomes from the Hercules trial. And you'll recall that the secondary outcomes were tested in a hierarchical manner, so that some of the outcomes were not tested for statistical significance, so we only have numerical data to rely on. But there was some mixed data in terms of the patients achieving 20% worsening of 9-hole peg test scores was not statistically significantly different, and that's in table 4. In table 5, we have that there was some difference in new or enlarging T2 lesions, but no change in brain volume loss. If you look at table 6, those are the key harms. And again, the most common harms were infections, nasopharyngitis, and the most substantial harm of liver toxicity. And again, we had 4% of the patients in the tolobrutinib group have some level of liver toxicity, and 4 patients, or 0.5%, had severe liver toxicity, including 1 death. So all of that led us to our evidence rating of promising but inconclusive. And if you scroll back, if you go back in the evidence summary to our evidence table, that encompasses both comparable to small to substantial net benefit, but also encompasses net negative benefit.
So thanks, Grace. And again, for the panelists, this is all from that you can see in the summary of evidence summary that we were given on page 7, 8, and 9, with the final analysis in terms of the benefit on page 5. At this point, are there any comments or questions for Grace? Jeffrey?
Hi, Dr. Lin. Thank you very much for your summary. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your choice of P/I, which is a little lower on the certainty and a little bit more favorable in terms of outcome profile compared to potentially a rating of C minus, which is a little bit more certain and a little bit less optimistic about benefit right before we take a vote on net benefit. Can you help me understand choice of neighborhood for your recommendation?
Sure, thank you. That's a good question. So we debated this, as you can imagine, quite a bit, and in part because we don't have all the data, and in part because we were weighing how much harm, could there be, right? Potentially. I think the fact that we didn't have some of the secondary outcome data, we still don't have some of the secondary outcome data, left us with the sense that, we should leave that door open, because what if there's something that hasn't been presented that pushes us into, well, this is actually substantial net health benefit. In terms of the toxicity, though, so two things. One is that the majority of the toxicity happened in the first 90 days of having the drug. So people, I think you knew early on whether you were going to have a problem, and so it wasn't like people were on this drug for months and months and months, and then started to have liver toxicity, and then the liver toxicity resolved if they were off the drug. That being said, we were not willing to close that door on having some level of net negative benefit, particularly because the stringent monitoring that was required, after the patient death, is when we talked to clinical experts, they said, well, that's probably not that practical. So, if you follow the clinical trial harms, there's all except for, after the protocol changed, nobody had went on to have the die from being on tolobrutinib. That was all before the protocol changed, but that was balanced by, we are not sure that necessarily this can work in the real world. We didn't think, though, that we didn't have enough certainty to say that, well, we think we shouldn't open the door to substantial net health benefit. We didn't have that amount of certainty to say we're sure that this drug isn't going to have substantial net health benefit. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Grace. Before I get to you, Lisa, I was interested, this is such an important question we're voting on. I'd like to hear a little bit from our experts, medical experts, their thoughts, in addition to the synopsis of the data that Grace so nicely presented. Ellen, you want to take that on initially, or?
Yeah, I mean, there just are a number of things for me. This would be a hard question to answer without, a lot more subgroup data available, because I'm still not really sure which group of patients I'm treating and whether the results of this trial as presented would apply to them yet. So I have a lot of concerns about not being able to see those subgroup analyses, particularly because it seems like perhaps some of those results may be driven by younger or less disabled people who might still have under not well controlled MS. And those are people who in this trial, most of them seem not to have been offered higher efficacy therapies in the past. So it's likely, given their age and ongoing active disease, that I would recommend those instead of the tolobrutinib. Regarding the liver function monitoring, for sure, I have some concerns about people being able to follow that protocol, and in particular about some of the equity in the distribution of being able to follow the protocol. I myself have noticed that, not everyone is even able to get to the lab because of a variety of factors. Even when the monitoring is required for every 6 months, it can be challenging. People have payers that don't want to pay for their labs to get done in their doctor's office. They have to make a second appointment often to go get those labs done. And therefore, trying to ask people to go once a week, taking time away from work to go do that, probably disproportionately causes trouble for those who have such access issues, and therefore kind of creates an inequity in the distribution of the medication.
Thanks, Ellen. Robert, I'm really interested in your perspective for us.
Sure. Thanks. I completely agree. In my view, looking at the matrix, which is not something that I'm super familiar with at baseline, the certainty level, I think, probably speaks to the overall kind of quantity of evidence, I guess. And in my view, basing a lot of this on a single trial inherently sort of has us at a lower certainty of level. That's sort of the way I was thinking about it. I agree about the challenges around getting patients for liver function tests frequently. When the MS community needs to come together around something like that, typically there is a solution. Typically, manufacturers go out of their way, I think, to try to provide solutions, but agree it is a logistic challenge. And just finally, I do think that patient selection, like when we envision taking something like this to the real world in practice, I think that patient selection is going to be one of the primary issues. I think you're going to see clinicians struggling with the question of whether they should have somebody on a highly effective existing monoclonal antibody or potentially put somebody on a new mechanism of action like this. And I think that likely if the clinicians feel it's someone who's younger or feel it's someone who is more likely to have disease activity, they're going to have them on a high efficacy existing therapy instead of this. And so I think that this will be mostly utilized in patients who are sort of at the core of that unmet need, where they're progressing in the absence of disease activity. But I do think that patient selection will probably keep this in that sort of a niche, and it may be a niche that has a commitment perhaps or to the safety monitoring as well. In other words, as prescribers, people would be willing to try it, but also needing to make sure that patients are on board with the required safety monitoring is sort of a compact between them, I guess.
Thank you so much for adding your perspective. Lisa.
Yeah, I think the experts kind of answered my question, which is, if I have it right, there is the unmet need, but we don't know if the people with the unmet need are the ones that benefited in the trial. And if the ones that benefited in the trial were not that group, the appropriate trial would be a comparison trial with the existing therapies. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people have been talking sort of all morning about how to assess progression. And if I had to characterize the unmet need, it's walk into an exam room, ask a patient with MS, are there things that you could do a year ago that you can't do now? And many of them would say yes. The answers might differ. So you've heard things about fatigue, walking troubles, dexterity problems, mood issues, bladder and bowel function. And that's where the heterogeneity comes in. But I think underlying that is some theory that there's some common pathophysiology there, and that impacting it with a treatment with a mechanism of action like this may get to the heart of some of the pathology underlying progression. Even though we acknowledge the way we measure it in clinic is really a challenge because of the heterogeneity. It all comes down to the fact that we do things a little bit backwards in MS, and that we're learning about the disease through our clinical trials and what works and what doesn't. It sure would be nice if we understood the mechanism first and then could target the mechanism. That would make a lot more sense, but we're forced to kind of learn about this in a backwards way.
Thanks again. Annetta?
Unmute myself. Yeah, so I wanted to actually just clarify a couple points. Secondary progressive MS is not necessarily relentlessly progressive. So there are plenty of patients who sort of get to a cane and then sort of sit around there and then eventually have a stroke, get cancer or a heart attack or something and die. They were enrolled in this trial. They needed to have demonstrated that they were having progression, but you can already see from the placebo arm that even over 2-3 years, it's not always like just because they've declined one year, they're going to decline the next. I agree a lot with what Ellen and Rob are saying. I think the bigger problem is we don't actually have the data. You notice how the Sanofi rep did not deny that they have actually been showing the subgroup data to their ad boards. And if it's embargoed, then that shouldn't be happening either. So I am very suspicious that it's not actually working in the group that we want this drug for. I think the issue around one trial is also a big reason, but the other issue, Jeff, is the disconnect between the 4 outcomes that matter in progressive MS trials. So you've got the 2 highly correlated on ambulation, but nothing. So if it's really working on neurodegeneration or smoldering MS, these other mechanisms, why is the 9-hole peg test data stone cold negative? It's not a power problem. It's not trending in the same direction. It's just exactly the same, right? So that gives me pause. And if it's really working on neurodegeneration, or it's somehow slowing down the pathophysiological process that underlies progressive MS, why are the curves stone cold negative for brain atrophy, our only objective measure in this study, right? So, I mean, I should say they haven't shown us some of the other objective measures, but the objective measure of progression. And then, lastly, when you sort of put into context with the relapsing remitting trial, where, it can't beat the worst drug on the market, where do we exactly think this drug will fit in? And I think for my patients, they're already coming in and asking, and I'm like, I'm not, for my inactive advanced SPMS patients, I'm telling them I'm not convinced that this drug will work. The last caveat I'll point out is if you look at those curves for the EDSS progression, they don't really separate until about 15 months. So that is a long delayed onset of action with lots of liver monitoring. Oh, actually, I wanted to make one more point. In the real world, if this gets FDA approved without a REMS monitoring program demanding that they get 1 week supply at a time, for those first 3 months, with liver function tests tied to that 1 week prescription, if that is not built into the FDA approval, what's going to happen in the real world is they're going to give them their month or 2 or 3 month prescription, whatever the payer allows them to provide, and then it'll be anybody's guess who's really getting the liver monitoring. That's okay.
Thank you for your perspective, Annetta. Jeffrey?
Thank you. As a non-clinical expert, I wanted to ask the clinical experts how much I should worry about a trial that has a mixture of 13% of the population that we're not voting about, as well as 83% of the population we're supposed to be voting about when we look at the results.
You always ask great questions, Jeffrey.
Thank you. I promise it's my last.
No, I don't. Don't stop. Ellen, you have your hand up, so I'm going to go with you first.
Okay, so I think you're talking about the people who have enhancing lesions at baseline. I would just really strongly point out that those people, it means that in the past 4 to 6 weeks, you happen to catch an active lesion. It doesn't mean that they didn't have other active lesions in the last 2 years. So this trial is not, this trial said non-relapsing, meaning nobody documented a relapse in the prior 2 years. It doesn't mean that they didn't have active disease. And to be honest, with that proportion of people who had never been treated, as well as of the treated people, if they were on treatment in the past year, which we don't know, we aren't really told a lot about when. We know when they were last absolutely allowed to be on a treatment, but we don't know when they actually were on it. So we really don't have a lot of data about whether these individuals had activity on their MRI scans. And again, because it's very hard sometimes when people have more disability on their examination to detect a relapse. If somebody has weakness in their legs at baseline, and then they're like, my legs are a little weaker, it can be really hard to decide, was that a relapse? Or was that actually just a bad day or a UTI, or it was hot out, or all these other things. So it's much easier to miss active relapses in this population. I was hoping maybe to make one more comment, a little bit adding on to Annetta's comment too. The people who are likely to be inactive are also older. And I was thinking about the people I serve and you know, who really would love to be treated and have their MS stop progressing, and what would happen if they needed a liver transplant. Right. And, you know, those folks are likely to be not as good candidates for a liver transplant too, right? Like, those are people who might be excluded from liver transplant based on age or comorbidities. So, you know, I really want to appreciate that the people who are older and more disabled and less likely to have active new spots are also at higher risk of, you know, negative consequences.
Thanks, Ellen. This is such an important point that Jeffrey asked. Robert, do you have any other additional thoughts here related to our patient group that we were studying before I go to Bob?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, if I think to my practice, I don't know what percentage of the patients in my practice that I would call pure progressive or non-active secondary progressive MS may have some sort of disease activity, because I think disease activity depends a little bit about how you measure it. If you measure it with an MRI with single dose traditional gadolinium, you might see lesions in 13%. If you use triple dose gadolinium, you might see lesions in 25% of those people that are active. And also the frequency and the kind of degree of precision with which you look. So when we look with, for instance, computerized MRI comparison measures, you can often see that there are enlarging lesions around the margins that we wouldn't have picked up with the naked eye. So I don't think a dichotomy per se of active versus non-active is probably true to biology. I think, you know, I guess having maybe 13% with gadolinium lesions at baseline is probably not that different from my patient population if I had to guess, if I left them all untreated. That being said, I think Annetta made a point in the chat that 25% of these people were untreated. And in the US, I think we would be controlling disease activity much more vigilantly with standard disease modifying therapies.
Thanks. Filoso, do you have a comment related to this question?
Yes, just again, quick follow-up to what Dr. Bermel said and to address Jeffrey's question. I just want to note that we are actually voting for non-relapsing secondary progressive. So that includes, it's not clear to us how the FDA is going to label this drug. They studied it in non-relapsing, that includes both the active and inactive, and this vote is covering that broader population.
Thank you. All right, Bob, you're up now. Thanks for waiting.
Oh, that's fine. I appreciate that comment, Felisa, spelling that out. It is always fascinating to me how we get into this, and the voting question seems so straightforward and simple, and some of the evidence is clearly kind of leaning one way or the other here, and yet we find ourselves in the same. Holy hell, I didn't realize it was quite as messy as it actually is. I feel very sorry, and I'm on your side. For the clinical experts that deal in this all the time, it's a hell of a place to be. Of course, we've been here before many times with different drugs, and reading the tea leaves, this gets FDA approval, hopefully, probably with a black box. I doubt if they're going to go as far as Annette suggested that they should, but they ought to. I just always find it fascinating that we end up in this position, and yet we know kind of what the answer is, and I don't know exactly. I never know how I would vote it if I was on the FDA panel when I do this. I know what I'm going to talk about if I'm during that meeting, and we'll still see where it goes. And Grace, I just got to throw one thing at you. If you would actually just throw some of these verbiages back at the manufacturers sometimes. Table 4 in our summary, which is 3.2 in the report, none of those patients wanted to achieve worsening scores on any of those tests. Patients would like to achieve no score on those damn tests and some actual progress against the disease rather than just holding off how bad it's going to get with us. So, you know, the patient never fails the treatment fails the patient.
Thank you, Bob.
true.
Thank you for those comments.
Yeah. Kathy, bring us home.
very much. A few comments about what we know and what we don't know. So there's lots of things we've all mentioned today about what we don't know relative to the data from this trial, which is, of course, unfortunate as we're trying to make some pretty important decisions. But I would also say that we're comparing a lot here to best supportive care. So that could include rehabilitation, optimal symptom management, holistic care. There's a lot that you can consider as best supportive care. I would argue that one of the things we don't know is who gets best supportive care. There are many places where people do not get rehabilitation services. They do not have their symptoms covered adequately. I only point this out is that we're comparing to something that we also don't know. Another thing, there are a number of people with pediatric MS. This drug is not for pediatric MS. That's not where I'm going. Pediatric patients get older and become adults. If they start their disease in their grade school years or in their teenage years, when might they become secondary progressive? Will they become secondary progressive? Based on a recent study looking at biological aging, they may actually, biological age as a driver of progression, they may actually begin to show signs of progression in their 30s. Well, that's not an older population, but could potentially be a population that ultimately needs a drug for a non-relapsing secondary progressive. But it's an unknown. It's another one of the things that we just don't know. Regarding the testing for liver enzymes, that's very arduous once a week. There are other medications that people have been placed on over the years that also require pretty tight monitoring. Another thing that we don't know and unknown, and I have no inside information on this, but is the company going to participate in any way in this monitoring? I don't know. It becomes another unknown that we have to ponder, just as we have to ponder the results, the clinical results from the trial that we have. I think that's it, but I just want to point out we're dealing with unknowns across the board. I'm not making this any easier, but these are all things I believe that we need to consider.
Okay, Ellen, your hand's up. I'll let you have the final word.
Okay. One other unknown I was thinking about as Kathy was talking is, is this compared to best supportive care? And there is something unique that happened during the context of this trial, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing I will tell you is that a lot of my patients who had or were teetering on what I presume to be progressive MS got markedly worse during this time period when they were unable to carry on, I think, just routine activities of daily living. I think we probably underappreciate how even getting out to the grocery store once a day maintains muscle mass in a way that sitting at home does not. And so the people who were selected to participate in the trial did have to demonstrate progression to get in. But I do worry a little bit about, were they all truly progressing due to neurodegeneration, or was some of it pseudoatrophy? And because the randomization of the trial was not stratified by country, but by US, non-US, and because different countries had different adherence about like isolation and time periods when people got back into their routines, I do wonder, could there be some imbalances or other things that might make people get worse or improve differently that's not related to the randomization itself. And also, I don't think it's likely that the people were getting the best standard supportive care during the context of most of this trial.
Ellen, that was really an excellent point. It does point out the huge challenges we had in all randomized clinical trials during the active point of the pandemic. I think we should take a vote now on, Grace, could you put up the question again? So at this point, I'm going to ask our panelists, the CTAF panelists, to cast their votes on the question, is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tolobrutinib is greater than the best of supportive care, defined as pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatment to alleviate the symptoms of MS. And remember, these are adults with non-relapsing secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. At this time, I'd like to ask you all to cast your vote.
Ralph, I'm jumping in here just to say we might have had an extra voter because I think our number was supposed to be 13.
I was thinking the same thing.
It's just no judgment if someone might have voted by accident. I'm looking to the program team if it's possible to re-vote, and I don't know if that's true because we could try again, and then without embarrassing anyone, we'll try to get to our magic 13. Becca, is that possible? Yes. Okay, we're going to re-vote everybody. Just a reminder, this is just for the voting members of the CTAF.
Yeah, I will second that, Sarah. Only the CTAF panelists were interested in your vote. So at this time, let's vote again on question number 1. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate net health benefit?
Now I gotta find it again. It was in the link was in the chat, as I recall.
Correct.
Oh, Lord.
The link came from Becca, Jeff. Just a couple of up in the chat right now.
I see it. Okay, here we go. Thank you.
I see 13 votes. Grace, I'm ready to display the votes when you are.
We're seeing them, Ralph. Can you see them?
Oh, yes. Okay. I didn't know if it was put up for the whole group. So what we see is that one person voted yes for current evidence adequate to demonstrate benefit, and 12 voted no. Okay. I think we've had a pretty robust discussion related to all the issues described, and I'm ready actually to go on to the next question. So now we're going to talk about benefits beyond health and special ethical priorities. Again, this is an opportunity for us to help inform judgments of the overall long-term value for money and indicate your level of agreement for the following statements. And we would either strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. And the first question is there is a substantial unmet need despite currently available treatments for the population of secondary progressive multiple sclerosis non-relapsing. Perhaps I'll ask Brett if as our lead modeler to give us his assessment. Brett?
Sorry, Ralph. I thought that was Grace, but maybe I have that wrong.
I think Ralph was asking that you had that slide about unmet need, the EVLY shortfalls. I
Equal
think,
value
Yeah.
life.
yes.
That's
Yep. And
awesome.
in the evidence summary, that's on page 12. If you go to that. I see what you mean. So if you look at that, the absolute shortfall that I presented in my slide deck, you think about shortfalls in my opinion, in two different ways. There's the compared to the average age of a typical American with no specific condition referenced. So that would be like the US life table in terms of mortality. Then we also compare that. So then that's like the big version of unmet need, an untreated or unresolved illness. And then what I did in the slide, we did as a team, is compare it to other conditions, one of which was chronic kidney disease and ALS. And those were quite similar from the evidence presentation to SPMS that I presented. So I can take any questions if there's any confusion around that.
Thanks. I was wondering if Kathy wanted to comment on this.
Well, I think I've stated earlier my feelings about unmet need. And there's a lot of medications out there, disease modifying therapies for MS. However, they do not in any way, in my mind, get at the pathology that we've been discussing relative to non-relapsing progressive MS. They are very good at relapses and acute inflammation. However, in this particular group that we're trying to get at a treatment, there is no treatment. Certainly not in a disease modifying therapy. So my feeling is that there is unmet need in this group.
Thank you, Kathy. Annetta?
Yes, I mean, I think that the thing that was alluded to earlier that, we haven't really looped back to is that the best we hope for in the trials in progressive MS patients is slowing of disability progression, not improvement or halting progression altogether. So there is a huge unmet need in this group. Like even the best available, highly effective therapies that are approved for primary progressive MS, which pathophysiologically is essentially the same thing as secondary progressive MS, they're very disappointing. They only work a little bit. And many patients do continue to decline. I said before, some people, they'll plateau out, but a lot of patients do decline. And, what breaks, I think, most neurologists' hearts is when we have these young patients who are, trying to raise their kids and they're losing their ability to walk. And we've got nothing for them. We can give them a B-cell depleting therapy and it might do a little bit, but ultimately they still decline. So that's it.
Okay. Any other comment that people want to make related to this before we vote? Hearing none, can we put forward the question again? So we're now going to vote on, there is a substantial unmet need despite currently available treatments for patients, adults with non-relapsing secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And you see the options 1 through 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So at this time, I would like you to vote. Let's see, I got to vote. Okay, so we now see the votes. Grace, thanks for putting it up. It looks like a very strong confirmation that there was, with 11 people voting as strongly agree and 2 as agreeing. Thanks very much. Okay, next question. So the next question here, again, to help inform judgments of overall long-term value for money is this condition of substantial relevance for people from a racial ethnic group that has not been equitably served by the healthcare system? Maybe I could ask Grace if you wanted to take on your impression on this question.
Yes, thanks, Ralph. So I will note that the overall MS population, there are some disparities in terms of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans having earlier onset, poorer outcomes, faster progression. We couldn't find data on the SPMS, this non-relapsing SPMS population specifically. So in terms of this specific population, we don't have any data, but presumably some of the data from the broader MS population applies.
Any other comments that anyone want to make? I mean, it's interesting that we talked about racial and ethnic groups, but one of the groups that we didn't really study that is very necessary was the older population here. Again, I wouldn't call that, I'll call that an age-related comment. Anetta.
Hi. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that work is actually mine, out of Kaiser, and they too, they get the disease at a younger age. They're less likely to get equitable access to therapy and more likely to progress. So when we say they have a worse outcome, that basically means that they're more likely to end up with secondary progressive MS at younger ages, and they also die at younger ages, African American males and women than white people in the United States. So there are big racial and ethnic disparities, and I'm worried that this drug will widen them because it's going to be expensive and require intensive monitoring to keep them safe.
Any other comments, Kathy or our experts? Jeff.
I would agree. When I see someone that's, young African American male, for example, I'm automatically talking to them really about you're going to be on highly effective therapy. I tend to do that with everyone these days, but even in the past when we weren't as familiar with it, you would take that patient and say, I know this potentially worse outcome, and would actually adjust therapy. So it's kind of well known and it's a real thing.
Thank you. Kathy.
I'll collect my thoughts a little bit. So I think that there's a problem in early and accurate diagnosis, which is going to be a driver of how people do in the long term, right? And so there's more delays in the African American and Hispanic populations. Also, there's less initial use of high efficacy disease modifying therapies, which is again going to be a driver of people not doing as well for as long. Even in the population of women in general, there's actually a little less use of high efficacy medications early. So I think that we are already set up for difficult futures for people. But I think that to Anetta's point, that this could create more disparities. It's possible, but it's one of those things we don't know, in that the monitoring, for example, the cost, two things we don't know all the answers to at this point in time. They could pose an enormous problem, but they may not. And that really just depends on information that we simply don't have.
Thank you. I think we're ready for voting on this question. Could you put up the question again? So again, we're going to be voting on this condition is of substantial relevance for people for a racial ethnic group that has not been equitably served by the healthcare system. And you're going to rate it between strongly agree to strongly disagree. So at this point, I'm going to ask us to vote. And we have 13 votes. That's good. And we had 1 neutral, 8 agree, and 4 strongly agree. I don't know if anybody wants to make a particular comment related to this vote. I think we're all pretty comfortable that it is relevant for racial ethnic groups. Okay, let's go to the next question. To help inform judgments of overall long-term value for money, please indicate your level of agreement for the following statements based on the relative effects of tolebrutinib versus best supportive care. Again, next slide. The treatment is likely to produce substantial improvement in caregivers' quality of life and ability to pursue their own education, work, and family life. And Grace, you want to give us your perspective?
I can actually, I think perhaps Kathy and Nancy are better equipped to answer this question about the caregivers, because everything I know comes from them.
Okay, Nancy, how about Nancy? You want to give us your perspective?
I don't know that it would make, unless it can stop the, let me back up. Since we're not talking about reversing progression, once you hit that point of whatever the progression is, even if it stops it, it's not going to improve things from where they're already at for the caregiver. So if you're already having to have assistance with activities of daily living, or if you're no longer able to work, or you can no longer do the laundry, this isn't going to bring that back. So the caregiver is still going to be picking up whatever it is. So the only hope is that it doesn't get any worse for the caregiver, from what I'm understanding, then it's going to improve for the caregiver.
You know, thanks, Nancy. Nancy, that's a very important perspective for us to keep in mind for our voting. Kathy, do you want to pile on a little bit?
On that, because I agree completely. This isn't reversing disability. And depending on where someone is when they would start this drug, it may be delayed for some time. And the impact on the caregiver, to me, would really be determined by where that starting point might be. And I think that's exactly what Nancy said. I would argue, and we're not even discussing this today, but I would argue where you start your treatment in the very beginning has more of a bearing on how that caregiver's role might change versus where we come in with this particular drug, where we're coming in the trajectory of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
Very helpful. Tony?
Yeah, I struggled with this question before. I think my question is, are we to assume that the answer to the very first question, the clinical evidence, was a no? Because if we're assuming it's a no, this question sort of answers itself. Or are we to assume that, hey, the treatment is fantastic and really works?
Ralph, you want me to?
Yeah,
help?
Filosa, you want to help me with that one?
So I don't think you need to assume that the number one is one. However, it is important we assume that this drug may get approved. And so I think in the context of thinking about that and how you think about the evidence of what this drug does and what you believe about this drug that could be FDA approved and given to patients, how you think it would impact the caregiver's quality of life.
Does that help you, Tony?
Yeah, yes and no.
Okay.
I know it's a difficult one, but all of that has to go into how you're voting, because it's the reality of it that if the drug, even though our vote could have been no, your vote could have been no. The reality of it is this drug, if it's FDA approved, patients would use it. And so how would you interpret it in the context of the caregiver voting?
Robert? Dr. Bermel?
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to make a comment about something that I hear patients and families, caregivers expressing commonly is that MS is a chronic disease, and patients and caregivers tend to extrapolate. So based on their rate of progression over 1 or 2 years' time, they start to think and worry about what will I be like in 10 years? What will I be like in 15 years? And do I need to change the type of home that I live in? Do I need to make very serious life accommodations? Is my caregiver going to be able to work anymore? We analyze these trials over 2 years' time, and analyzing, slicing and dicing the survival curves here. A long-term kind of prospect like that seems a little bit irrelevant, I guess, but I think it's good, even if it doesn't apply to this particular treatment as much, to kind of ground what the group considers in terms of, I think, what I hear from patients and their caregivers, kind of how they're thinking about these chronic disease type issues and how it tends to accumulate over time, such that small differences over, 1 to 2 years might make a substantial life impact over 5, 10, 15 years.
Great. Lisa, one more, I'm conscious of time, but make it quick.
I'll be
Very
quick.
interested in what you have to say.
I'll be quick. I think one of the things, and I appreciate Nancy and Kathy's comments because it got me thinking a little bit more about this and the importance of where people are when you're starting this. But for people who have greater disability at the onset, there will be an increased care help or burden getting in for weekly LFTs. And if there are people who are going to have to take off work to do that, and liver function testing monitoring may be increasing the burden.
Good point. Joanna?
That's actually exactly what I was going to say in terms of the burden on caregivers that potentially this drug treatment would create, that it might in fact increase their responsibilities and necessary to take time off of work to bring people in for liver testing.
Thanks, Joanna. Joy, a quick point?
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I just trying to respond more directly to Tony's question and somewhat echoing what others have said. I think under, almost regardless of the vote on the first question that we voted on about effectiveness, even if it is effective, it doesn't seem to be effective at reversing progression. So whatever state the person's in at the time, it just slows down progression. So from the caregiver perspective, things aren't going to improve from where they are now. They might not get worse as quickly is really what we're talking about. And then the other points I think are also very valid. So
Thanks, Joy. Kathy, we cannot miss the wisdom that's going to come from you at this time.
Amazing, isn't it? So I think this is a follow on from Rob's comment and clarification of my own comment. So people would often say to me, when my wife, mother, whomever it happens to be, became weak, we kind of accommodated and we got used to that. When he or she needed to use a wheelchair, we got used to that. When they needed additional care, well, we got used to that. But I don't know if we can get used to this, and I don't know if we can meet this challenge. And so I think people look at it in terms of what might happen next, but they do figure out along the way what they need to do to meet the challenge. And it's not that I'm not saying that that's easy in any way. So I think when we look at where people are and when we're trying to delay that next step, that could be remarkably important to that family member, whatever that next step might be and how it might change the treatment or support or the care that's needed.
All right, thank you very much for that. And let's put up the question again. The treatment is likely to produce substantial improvement in caregivers' quality of life and ability to pursue their own education, work, and family life. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. And I'm now going to ask the panelists from CTAF to vote. Okay, interesting. We have 4 strongly disagree, 6 disagree, 3 neutral. I think that our discussion has helped us a lot in terms of that answer, and it's consistent with some of our earlier voting. All right, now we're going to do our last vote, which is the treatment offers a substantial opportunity to improve access to effective treatment by means of its mechanism of action or method of delivery. Grace, do you want to give us a perspective?
Sure. This is a new mechanism of action for MS, a BTK inhibitor, and it is an oral formulation, so a daily oral pill. I'll note that most of the other highly effective disease-modifying therapies are infusions, so that this is a differentiation between those and this drug, which is an oral formulation.
Any other comments from a group? Okay, Paul?
Yeah, I'll just say the way that I think when we're talking about, we're using the word substantial in here. So I feel that even if I feel if it is an improvement, but it's not a substantial improvement, then I'm disagreeing. So I'll just, I think that we should point that out, that that's the way a lot of these questions have been phrased.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Paul. Ellen?
Yeah, there are other oral medications, and although there is a tendency to assume that, people should all be on higher efficacy therapies, actually many people do quite fine from the perspective of relapse and lesion formation control on oral therapies. So, and then finally, it wouldn't really compare people using higher efficacy IV therapies, people who would be using this medication, because they may not really be serving the same group of people, and the folks who need higher efficacy infusion therapies may not be safe to go off of them and take risks of inflammatory activity to go onto this medication, which we can see from the RR trials is less potent, if that makes sense. So I don't think that the IV to oral comparison is a great one in my perspective.
Thanks. Annetta?
Yeah, so ditto what Ellen said. The crux of the matter here is, right, so would we use it in somebody with active SPMS? No. Over other therapies? No, because we have much better therapies. We've got 3 trials to tell us that it's not really a great choice for somebody with active inflammation, because we have the 2 relapsing remitting trials stacked against the worst drug on the market, the least effective drug on the market, and they still couldn't beat it, and they actually showed a little more inflammation on MRI scans in the tolebrutinib trial. And then I'm left uncertain whether there is a treatment benefit in the inactive subgroup, because they're not showing us that data. And so, I'm open if they eventually do come up with the data and show us that it does work in inactive groups, to change my mind. But until I see that data, I'm going to assume that it's negative, because I need to assume that it's negative. And so I don't see any kind of substantial, that's like Paul pointed out, the terminology of substantial benefit, like we haven't seen that evidence. So.
Okay. I must say, Annetta, I wouldn't assume that's negative. I just don't know. Catherine?
Yeah, Paul raised an interesting point about how we vote. Because if it improves access, but it's not substantial improvement, to me, I would define that as neutral. Because if I say disagree, then I seem to be indicating that I disagree that it improves access. So just a different framing of how we're defining the vote.
A good comment, and I know that Jeffrey is going to tell us how we should frame it.
No, I was just going to make things more complicated. It seems like we can fuss about whether it's substantial or not, and we could fuss about whether it's going to improve access or not. But then the last part of the question says by means of mechanism of action or method of delivery. And my sense is that the triumph here is that it exists. Like there wasn't one before and now there is. It's not that we used to be using something in this group of people and now we're going to make something that will make a new thing, not the old way we used to do it, but a brand new thing. And because of this brand new thing, mechanism of delivery, not its existence, its mechanism of delivery, now we have suddenly substantially better access.
So it turns out, Jeffrey, you did exactly what I thought you would do. You shed light on the actual question. Tony.
Yeah, the question of what substantial, how relevant that is in this is interesting, but to me, the the fact that treatment is an oral treatment would seem on the surface to be much easier than an infusion. But on the other hand, going along with this oral treatment is you're going to have a weekly test in a clinic, and I don't think that's going to help the caregivers very much.
Okay, I think it's time to vote. Thanks for that comment, Tony. So let's put up the question again. The treatment offers a substantial opportunity to improve access to effective treatment by means of its mechanism of action or method of delivery. And again, we're talking about tolobrutinib for secondary progression of multiple sclerosis. And you see how, again, voting between strongly disagree to strongly agree. I will now ask the CTAF panelists to vote. And the voting shows 2 strongly disagree, 6 disagree, 5 neutral, with no one voting for agree or strongly agree. So I want to thank all the CTAF panelists for their voting and also all the comments to help us from our experts and our patient representatives. At this time, we have a break. And we're going to return for our policy roundtable in about 9 minutes at 1 p.m. Pacific time and 4 p.m. Eastern time. See you soon.